Hi, I'm Linda Broxick, the Principal Research Lead for Knowledge Management here at APQC. But I'm also a previous member of APQC and spent over 20 years of my career developing and building KM programs within large organizations. I'd like to share with you some insights on the impact of having mature KM capabilities within your organization and how you and your organization will know when your efforts are paying off. Measuring your organization's capabilities against our 5 levels of KM maturity help in a couple of ways. They provide a roadmap for moving from those inconsistent and immature KM activities to those more disciplined and mature approaches that really align with your organization's strategic objectives. Secondly, it can be used as a great tool for communicating the knowledge management vision and building buy-in, or just showing progress and sharing your journey with leadership and others in the organization. So, how do you actually measure your maturity? The answer is by using the KM Capability Assessment Tool. We also refer to that as the KM CAT. And this assessment is comprehensive and correlates to the 5 levels of maturity in order to help you really easily measure and achieve success along your entire KM journey. There's 12 capabilities associated with the assessment, but they're divided into 4 easy categories to remember: strategy, people, process, and technology. I'd like to start by talking about the 3 capabilities within the strategy category: objectives, business case, and budget. One of the first steps in establishing a KM program is to identify objectives. Why would an organization want to move and improve the flow of knowledge? And what does it hope to achieve? In a less mature KM program, objectives may not be clearly defined, but the organization is generally aware of the business needs that KM can and probably could help address. As the organization begins to mature and the level of maturity increases, you will see more documented objectives and better alignment to broader business goals. Second, to continue receiving support and funding for your KM program, you're going to need a solid business case. And at those lower levels of KM maturity, the business case helps to explain the need for KM in a more general way. Again, as maturity increases, the business case clarifies the link between KM and business value by helping you lay out the measured and the documented benefits. When you reach the highest levels of maturity for building a business case, enterprise knowledge processes become a competitive advantage and a marketable asset in and of themselves. And finally, an organization can't sustain a KM program without budget or funding. So at the lower levels of maturity, the KM budget might exist, but they're often very localized and connected to specific goals, projects, or timelines. As the maturity increases in this space, the budget will become more stable and integrated into regular enterprise strategic planning and budgeting cycles. So just to recap, the 3 areas of the strategy category are objectives, business case, and budget. I remember the first KM program I worked on and the challenges we had articulating the importance of KM to our senior leaders. When the assessment came along, it changed everything. In the aerospace industry I worked in, we used maturity models and assessments for other capabilities like quality, manufacturing, or process improvement. The KM assessment then gave us a structure and a language and metrics that we could correlate to current practices, and it gave us the ability to show the gaps and the opportunities in our knowledge management space. Our sponsorship finally saw the true value in KM, and having the maturity levels gave us something to strive for, and the assessment also gave us a tool to communicate and build our strategic plan more effectively, ultimately showing the progress and allowing us to celebrate along the journey. So now that we've discussed the strategy capabilities, let's move on and talk about the capabilities associated with people. These include resources, governance, change management, and communications. To start with resources, in addition to funding, an organization must allow employees to dedicate time and energy to knowledge sharing activities. Typically, resourcing starts with support from specific areas of the business and the formation of a KM team to design the strategy. More mature organizations have active knowledge champions or facilitators and super users that they use throughout the business. And then at the highest levels of maturity, KM aligns with core competencies and performance assessments, and participation is built into most employees' jobs. Secondly, for governance, this outlines the roles and structures needed to ensure knowledge flow processes and activities are actually taking place. At those lower levels of maturity, governance is typically localized and it might be a little bit ad hoc. As you begin to mature, the governance grows more robust and is aligned with enterprise governance. Now, the most mature organizations and programs have senior leadership sponsorship and alignment at the highest levels. Next, let's talk about change management. Change management provides the facilitation and the incentives that enable employees to adjust their behaviors in order to be able to incorporate knowledge sharing and reuse into their everyday work. At the lower levels of maturity, organizations will begin to assess the cultural capabilities for knowledge sharing activities and the potential barriers to actually being successful. As the maturity increases, the organization will more systematically address barriers and establish formal training and coaching, maybe some resistance strategies, put in place rewards and recognition, and actually have a structure of accountability. And finally, with communication, this helps employees and leaders really understand the KM approaches and the goal of those efforts. And finally, the desired behaviors that we're looking for. At the lower levels of KM maturity, organizations will convey the basic KM concepts and some of the benefits to stakeholders and mostly early adopters. The more mature your program is for KM, they will have those more formal communication plans that actually publicize successes, maybe have some branding, ensure employees understand tools and approaches and ways to get employees excited and engaged with knowledge sharing. The most mature programs actually have very strong KM brands, and that actually drive the desired internal behavior as well as providing you with a competitive advantage. So to recap from the people category perspective, the capabilities that are really important center around resources, governance, and change management and communications. So KM is a people business first. And early in my career, one of our KM capabilities, communities of practice to be exact, was struggling to gain some traction and support. And it wasn't because we didn't have a good solution, at least that's what we thought. What we found was we weren't applying it to all the right areas in a way that really resonated with our subject matter experts, the people. They had real problems to solve and priorities that we didn't completely understand. And we didn't take the time to listen to them at first. So we had to pivot. We held a series of knowledge cafes and focus groups and interviews, and we aligned it to leadership expectations again. And then that opened our eyes to the real problems. It allowed us to see into their world and then make the shifts in our strategy. When we truly understood the critical knowledge needs they were facing and the importance of a change management approach to KM, it made all the difference. Going forward, not only did we build better, more sustainable KM products, we actually gained the trust and established champions within the organization that lasted for years to follow. So now we've talked about strategy and people. Let's get into the capabilities associated with process. This includes knowledge flow process, KM approaches, and measurement. First, the knowledge flow process defines how an organization's knowledge is created, identified and collected, reviewed, shared, adapted, and then used or reused. Think of the knowledge flow process framework circle with value in the center and always the ultimate goal. And remember that value is not really achieved until you've used or reused the knowledge that was created. In less mature organizations, knowledge flow is handled through more informal or one-to-one exchanges. As your maturity level increases, knowledge flow processes will become more stabilized or standard and begin to be embedded in the core business processes. Then at the highest levels of maturity, knowledge sharing becomes part of how work gets done. It's part of the culture or just the way we do things around here. Second, KM includes a number of varied approaches to enable the flow of knowledge. Things like communities of practice, lessons learned, collaboration and social tools, or other knowledge transfer techniques. In less mature organizations, knowledge transfer is ad hoc at best. Then as the maturity increases, KM programs provide standardized processes and tools to really help the flow of knowledge begin to move. At the highest maturity levels, KM approaches become more consistently implemented across the organization and fully supported by the enterprise and the corporate structure. And last but not least, we must measure KM in order to justify the cost of the investment and to continually evolve and improve and show the value. At lower levels of maturity, KM programs focus on developing a value proposition, identifying some of those key performance indicators or KPIs, and collecting some activity metrics, maybe the number of hits on a site or the number of participants in a community of practice. Now, more mature organizations are going to standardize their measures and actually start to calculate ROI. At the highest levels of KM maturity, organizations can really correlate those KM measures with business outcomes, and they can begin reporting them side by side with other business imperative measures. So just to recap the process category, it includes knowledge flow processes, KM approaches, and measurement. Now, for me, measures have always been one of the greater challenges for KM teams, and I experienced that myself early on in my career. Like anything new, leaders will want to see the value to the business or why invest in it. Some understand the intangible value of establishing KM practices and that they'll ultimately lead to business value, but most really want to see those numbers. I was lucky to have leaders who knew there was a value when we started our KM program, and they didn't ask much beyond simple measures. But sponsorship changed over time with reorganizations and other changes happening. And suddenly we were in the spotlight and asked to prove the value in order to maintain our KM team and those capabilities. We had to do a little bit of scrambling, and beyond simple metrics, we had to engage the help of, yes, APQC to help us establish some more correlations and really help us show the business value we were bringing. Over time, we were able to partner with our new sponsor very effectively and develop an even better scorecard that worked for our organization. The interesting thing was our approach kept us consistently at a level 3 from a maturity perspective for measurement, not a level 4 or 5, and that was okay. It was a conscious decision by our leadership to develop enough measures to show the value they knew that came from the KM program without spending more time measuring than actually helping people with their knowledge sharing activities. Our leaders knew that KM was a people first business as well. Okay, now the final category of the KM maturity assessment. We've talked about strategy, we've talked about people, and we've talked about process. Now it's time to talk about technology, a critical enabler to the success of any KM program. And this includes both content management and information technology. First, let's talk about content management. This is a structured process to store, deliver, and facilitate access to enterprise content. Less mature organizations focus on basic document or information management. And as your KM maturity increases, organizations develop standard taxonomies and workflows. At the highest levels of maturity, content management is used to share and transfer knowledge, facilitate collaboration, and uncover innovation across the business. Now, while information technology or IT is not a silver bullet for KM, it's almost impossible to manage an organizational knowledge program without enabling technologies. When organizations are just getting started, they leverage existing IT tools to help support KM. And then as maturity increases, standardized KM tools are implemented as part of the enterprise IT strategy. The most mature organizations integrate innovative KM technology to provide streamlined access to knowledge resources and ensure users are connecting to the most relevant information and expertise. So to recap the technology category, there's two areas: content management and information technology. But to be honest, when I started in my KM career over 20 years ago, technology was a pain point for me and my company. Obviously, we didn't have the types of solutions we have today, but we also didn't have a tight partnership with IT, and our KM team was not in the IT organization. Now, there are two schools of thought. If your KM team is in IT, you will have greater access to the cool new tools, but may also suffer from a very technology-driven KM strategy. The flip side is not being in IT can create challenges for developing the right tech solution to ensure that knowledge is actually growing and flowing to the right people at the right time. Not to mention the priority and budget challenges if you don't own the technology budget. In my experience, and according to our research at APQC, developing key partnerships within organizations like digital or IT early on the KM journey will serve you well. I was able to make our IT collaboration and search teams champions and key influencers for our KM strategy. They even participated in our cross-functional steering committee and contributed to the KM assessment on a regular basis. We wouldn't have been successful without them. So to wrap this up, if you want to increase knowledge management maturity in your organization, your program must effectively distribute resources across all 12 of the capabilities that we discussed and that fall within the 4 categories: strategy, people, process, and technology. Understanding APQC's 5 levels of KM maturity and assessing your organization's capabilities will help you pinpoint the areas that could be holding your KM program back. More importantly, based on my experience, our research, and continually learning from others, assessing helps you in so many ways. Understanding your starting place, capturing baseline measures for future comparison, identifying those emerging gaps or areas of stagnation, prioritizing the weak areas to focus on, demonstrating and documenting your incremental progress, and communicating what's needed to improve and opportunities to scale. And finally, showcasing and celebrating success. So good luck with your KM journey. Remember to stay aligned to the business, keep a strong focus on the people, and make it fun. I look forward to partnering with you along the way.